How is everybody doing? Positive and productive, I hope. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with me. Hey, do me a favor. Please share the content with friends, family, anybody that you think the content is relevant to. Remember, local elections are more important than national elections. Dollars are stronger than votes. They won't stop until we stop them. Liberation comes at a cost. Who's willing to pay for it? Ladies and gentlemen, before we jump into this, if you're on YouTube, please place a purple heart in the algorithm. It helps feed the algorithm, and YouTube does all their fancy stuff. Appreciate it highly. All right, jumping into this really quickly because it's relevant, it's current, it's right now. There's a lot of different stuff about it. People are saying so much, and I even had so many different conversations earlier in the day, and I'm just like, I can't do it. I just can't do it. So let's make content, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, what I first initially did was I asked the AI, and this is Gronk here. I said, can you open or access contents of a link, say to Google or another LLM? Yes, I can access and retrieve the contents of most public web links, including pages from Google or other search engines, news sites, blogs, etc., etc. How it works. So it told me that it can access links. So I shared a link with it. The link you shared is a public shared link for a Google AI mode or AI overview response from Google search. When I accessed it, the page acts as a redirect, shortened, and points to an underlying Google search results. The core query tied to this AI search response appeared to be that the United Nations confirmed transatlantic slave trade was the gravest injustice to humanity. The page itself shows a standard Google search interface with that question, plus a note about enabling JavaScript if not directed automatically, what this means. So you see it, and so I'm going to talk about a little bit about the JavaScript and all that stuff. You guys can pause it as you need to and different things of that nature. So let's get to the crux of all of what we need to get to. So I said, now what I would like to understand is from the very metrics set forth by the UN, how would the Arab slave trade not fit the description of gravest crime? So the UN's exact metric from the March 2025-2026 General Assembly resolution adopted 123-3 with 52 absentees, led by Ghana in this: the trafficking of enslaved Africans and radicalized chattel slavery, enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity by reasons of the definitive break in world history, scale, duration, systemic nature, brutality, and enduring consequences that continue to structure the lives of all people throughout racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. So that was a lot, but this is how the UN says they came with their metric of how they deemed that the transatlantic slave trade was the worst crime against humanity. The trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavements of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity by reasons of the definitive break in world history, scale, duration, systemic nature, brutality, and enduring consequences that continue to structure the lives of all people throughout racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. This language is very specific. It doesn't just say slavery was bad in general. It singles out the transatlantic slave trade, roughly 1500s through 1800s. 12 to 15 million Africans transported because of its claimed unique role in creating modern racial hierarchies, Western capitalism, and ongoing global inequalities. The resolution ties it explicitly to reparations, apologies, and confronting anti-Black racism legacies, applying the UN's own criteria to the Arab Islamic slave trade, Sahara, Indian Ocean, Red Sea slave trade. This slave trade ran from the 7th century CE to the early 20th century, over 1,300 years, far longer than the transatlantic. Estimates of Africans enslaved range from 6 to 18 plus million. Trans-Sahara alone often cited at 6 to 10 million, plus Red Sea and East African routes, with some historians putting total numbers comparable to or exceeding the transatlantic when including all branches. It's driven by Arab Muslim traders, states, and Islamic legal frameworks that permitted slavery of non-Muslims and sometimes others. Here's the direct comparison using the UN's listed reasons. Duration. The Arab trade wins decisively. It lasted 3 to 4 times longer. So do y'all even hear that right there? So duration. So here's the direct comparison using the UN's listed reasons. Duration. The Arab trade wins decisively. It lasted 3 to 4 times longer. 7th through 20th century versus 400 years of transatlantic. It continued into the 1900s in places like Zanzibar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, officially abolished as late as 1960s in some areas. The UN calls transatlantic duration a key factor for Gravest, yet the Arab one alone endured far longer. Scale. Comparable or larger in raw numbers. Over time, transatlantic moved 12.5 million with 2 million deaths in the middle passages. Arab routes involved millions across deserts and seas with high en route mortality, often estimated at 50% or more in some trans-Saharan caravans. Total impact on sub-Saharan Africa was massive and sustained for centuries. Systemic nature. Fully institutionalized. It was embedded in Islamic economies, militaries, and households for over a millennium. State-sponsored raids, markets, unit corps, harems. It wasn't ad hoc. It was a core part of trade society across North Africa, the Middle East, and Indian Ocean's network. Brutality. At least as severe, often more so in specific cases. The Middle Passage was horrific, but Arab routes featured desert treks with extreme death rates, plus widespread castration of male slaves, especially for eunuchs guarding harems or serving in palaces. Historical accounts put mortality from castrations at 30 to 80%, higher for adults, lower but still deadly for boys. Many female slaves became concubines, sex slaves. Some reports note children of slaves being killed to prevent lineages. Assimilation often erased African identity entirely. This was not gentler slavery. It was designed for control and often prevented reproduction. Definitive break in world history and enduring consequences through racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. This is where the UN's framing diverges sharply. The resolution emphasizes the transatlantic trade rule. So before we get into this, the reason why I read all that is because I just wanted to compare the metric that they used, and if we compared the same rules of how they came to their own conclusion against the Arab slave trade, it almost doesn't make any sense. So then a lot of people realize that, and this is why the UN says they made their decision. Definitive break in world history and enduring consequences through racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. This is where the UN's framing diverges sharply. The resolution emphasizes the transatlantic trade's role in creating modern racialized systems, chattel slavery tied to skin color, hereditary. That doesn't say hereditary. Yeah, it does. Hereditary linked to European colonialism, the Americas plantations, and today's global economic racial structures. The Arab trade, While involving racial elements, sub-Saharan Africans were often seen as inferior in Arab Islamic writings, operated differently. Slaves were frequently integrated via conversion to Islam. Manumission was more common in theory, and descendants were often absorbed or eliminated. Fewer surviving diaspora populations due to castration and practices. It didn't spawn the same racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. The UN ties to Western modernity. Its enduring effects were devastating for Africa. Demographics lost instability, but aren't framed as structuring today's global capitalism or anti-black racism in the West in the same way. Bottom line, the UN's own listed metrics, especially for duration, systemic scale, and brutality. The Arab slave trade fits or exceeds the gravest label in multiple ways. It's not a minor footnote. It was one of history's longest and most sustained systems of enslaving Africans, yet the UN's resolution makes no mention of it, or any parallel declaration exists in UN history. Searches of UN documents, resolution, and statements turn up zero equivalent condemnations, framing the Arab slave trade this way. Many Arab Muslim majority countries voted in favor of the Transatlantic resolution. Of course they did. This isn't about minimizing the transatlantic trade. It was a monstrous crime, but the selective application of the UN's metric reveals it's not a neutral universal standard for the gravest crime against humanity. It's tied to a specific historical narrative focused on European Western responsibility, reparations politics, and modern racial discourse. Other slave trades, Arab, Ottoman, African, internal, ancient ones, don't get the same treatment, even when they match or surpass the criteria on raw facts. History has many chapters of slavery across cultures. Applying one standard consistently would require acknowledging all of them as crimes against humanity, not just the one that fits today's geopolitical lens. If you'd like sources on specific estimates, primary accounts, or further comparisons, let me know. I know that was a lot. Please bear with me. If you're still here, drop a purple heart in the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, I do this for the facts so we all can be educated. And I'm not saying you should believe what I believe. I'm providing the facts, and now you can believe what you choose to believe based on the information that's set forth. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Again, if you're here on YouTube, please drop a purple heart in the comment section. It feeds the algorithm. So, this is what I said. Based on the criteria, the numbers, the information, and the UN's metrics set forth, it's safe to conclude the UN either made a mistake or is contradicting its position by labeling the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. That's what I said. This is what it said. Yes, based on a consistent, neutral application of the UN's own stated metrics from the March 25th, 2006 resolution A80L40, the selective designation of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity creates a clear inconsistency or contradiction. The UN's explicit criterion from the resolution text. The resolution declares the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, i.e. the transatlantic system, as the gravest crime by reason of the definitive break in world history, scale, duration, systemic nature, brutality, enduring consequences that continue to structure lives through racialized regimes of labor, poverty, and capital. It further calls this the most inhumane and enduring injustices, linking it to modern reparations, apologies, and addressing anti-black racism. Direct comparison using those same criteria. Duration, transatlantic, 400 years, roughly, 5th century through 19th century. Arab slave trade, Trans-Sahara, Red Sea, Indian Sea equals 1300 plus years, 7th century CE into the 20th century, with official abolishings as of the 1960s in some places. The longer one clearly exceeds this metric. Scale, transatlantic estimates, 12 to 15 million Africans transported with significant middle passage deaths. Arab trade estimates, commonly 6 to 18 million plus, trans-Saharan often 6 to 10 million, total Oriental Indian Ocean routes adding millions more. Some historians place combined Arab routes at comparable or higher cumulative numbers over the much longer period, not decisively smaller. Systemic nature. Both were deeply institutionalized. The Arab trade was more embedded in Islamic law, which permitted enslavement of non-Muslims. State economies, military example, slave soldiers, and household systems across empires for over a millennia. It involved organized raids, markets, and supply chains from sub-Saharan Africa. Brutality. The transatlantic middle passage was horrific. Disease, overcrowding, high mortality. Arab routes including deadly desert treks, high en-route death routes, often estimating 50% plus in some caravans, and notably widespread castration of male slaves, especially for eunuchs in harems or palaces. Historical accounts describe castration survival rates as low as 10 to 20% in some cases, with extreme suffering. Female slaves, frequently served as concubines, sex slaves, practices often permitted reproduction and cultural practices often prevented reproduction and cultural continuity more thoroughly in some branches. Definitive break in world history and enduring consequences, though through racialized regimes. This is the key differentiator in the UN text. The resolution frames the transatlantic trade as uniquely creating modern global racial hierarchies, Western capitalism, colonialism's legacies, and today's racialized economic systems. The Arab trade involved racial ethnic hierarchies, Africans often viewed as inferior in period sources, and caused massive demographic, social, and developmental harm to Africa. However, it did not produce the same large-scale diaspora with visible racialized legacies in the Americas, or the specific linkage to modern Western institutions that the resolution emphasizes. Descendants were often assimilated, castrated, lineages ended, or identities erased. Different long-term structural outcomes. On raw metrics of duration, systemic scale over time, in certain aspects of brutality, example castration, mortality, the Arab trade matches or exceeds the transatlantic one. Yet the UN resolutions makes no mention of it, nor has the UN issued any equivalent gravest crime declaration for the Arab Islamic trade or many others throughout history, such as internal African slavery, Ottoman systems, or ancient one. Searches of UN document confirms this absence. The contradiction. If the UN's criteria are meant to be objective measures of identifying the singular gravest crime, then applying them evenly should require acknowledging other trades that score similar or higher on several axes. Instead, the resolution singles out one specific trade tied to European Western involvement while ignoring parallels or preceding systems involving Arab, Muslim, and African actors. This selective focus aligns more with contemporary political narratives around reparations, anti-colonialism, and racialized regimes in the West in the West than with a universal historical standard. The United States. one of only 3 no votes alongside Israel and Argentina, explicitly criticized this in its explanation of vote, noting that trafficking of African slaves predated the 15th century and continued afterward. It argued against creating a hierarchy of crimes against humanity and pointed out that the resolution's framing appeared politically motivated rather than purely historical. Several European countries abstained for similar reasons, avoiding hierarchies or suffering. Not a mistake in the narrow sense. This isn't likely a factual oversight by the UN Secretariat on historians' involvement. The resolution was proposed by Ghana and passed with strong support from many global South nations, 123 in favor, 52 abstentions. It reflects a deliberate political and ideological choice, elevating one chapter of history for moral, legal, and repertory purposes while de-emphasizing others that do not fit the narrative of Western responsibility in racial capitalism. All forms of slavery across humanity, including the Transatlantic, Arab, and countless others, were profound crimes against humanity, involving immense suffering, ranking one as singularly the gravest, while metrics don't uniformly support uniqueness, introduces inconsistency. A more coherent UN approach would condemn all large-scale historical slave trades as crimes against humanity without selective elevation. If you would like deeper dives into specific, and then that's the end of it right there. So I read all that for a reason. 1, because niggas don't like to read, so I read it for you. 2, because if we're gonna be fair, and what do I mean by fair? Let's use logic. And if we're using the own criteria that the UN set forth, it doesn't make sense. That's like if I say, okay, we're going to use this as the best person who's the basketball player. And I say what we're going to say is the best basketball player is the most rings, the most triple doubles, the most points scored. I give you these reasons. I list out my reasons that says this is the best. And then I say, okay, this person is the best. And then you say, wait, hold on. These other people exceed those points, exceed those rings, match the same criterion, and then you say, oh, but hold on, the other people you named, they didn't do this one specific thing that I didn't mention, which was they never played in the West Coast. They never played in the Western Conference. And it's like, so are you saying who's the best player in the NBA? Or are you saying that, you know what I mean? So are you saying what's the worst crime against humanity in the world? Or are you saying what's the worst crime against humanity that Western society benefited from? Like, exactly what are you saying here? Because the way you're saying it and the way you come to your conclusion, it's not making any sense, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not. And we have to take and listen. I had a conversation with a gentleman earlier, right? And we were really talking about this specific thing and a few other different things. And one of the things I told him, I said, listen, don't take this the wrong way when I said take your feelings and your emotions out of this, right? A lot of times as men, when people say, and sometimes people are taking jabs and shots, they do mean it this way. They say, you know, when they say, oh, you're being emotional, or, you know, they're trying to make a jab and say you're being like a woman, or they're trying to call a shot or something like that. But a lot of times when you're talking to fair, reasonable people who like to have genuine conversations, when they tell you to remove your emotions or don't look at it emotionally, as a man, he's not saying you're looking at it as a woman or from a woman's perspective. But what he is saying is you're not using your logic fairly. For the same thing as how you came to this conclusion, or what you use to measure this over here, it's not the same thing that you're measuring or come to the conclusion over there. And for instance, what I gave him the for instance was, he gave me the point that China and other nations agreed that this was the worst crime against humanity, and then pointed out, so are we saying that China and these other nations got it wrong? But later on in the conversation, he then alluded to he doesn't care what goes on in China. He's not worried about what they do, what they think, or what they say. So then I brought that dichotomy to his point, and this is what I mean by take your emotions out of it. Not to say you're thinking about it or you're being a woman or anything, but to say take your emotions, because on one aspect you said, see, China said this, and this is partially why I kind of agree here, because China said it. But then on another breath, you said, I don't care what China says, does, thinks, or believes. That doesn't have anything to do with me. So on one breath, you'll exclude what China thinks, believes, does, and says, but then on another aspect, you'll use what China thinks, believes, does, and says as your proof. So if you're going to believe what they say or use it as your proof, you can't exclude or say, I don't care about it over there. So let's use the same logic equally. And he conceded to the point, not to the point of it wasn't the gravest crime against humanity, but to the point of he wasn't using his logic equally. If he does care what China says, then he has to use it equally when China does say something over here, even if it doesn't fit his point or his narrative. So, and that's just what I mean by using logic. Let's not look at it in front. And that's what for me, in my perspective, when I tell people don't use your emotions, that means you're getting blinded by how you feel about it, and you're not being fair. That's what I mean. So maybe you have a preconceived notion because, for instance, maybe you don't like Hondas because you were always pulled over by the police in Hondas and you have bad experience with Hondas. So now when I'm trying to tell you that Honda is safer than Volvo, this is just hyperbole or just for sake of argument, ladies and gentlemen. So if I say Honda is better than Volvo and here's the reasons why, don't tell me, well, it doesn't matter that they got better brakes, better stopping power, JD Power and Associates. Don't say we all know that most people who roll around in Hondas get pulled over by the police. Like, we can't use another metric that doesn't have anything to do with now how we're formulating this opinion now. And we do that a lot, ladies and gentlemen. We like logic in a lot of our conversations, it eludes us, and this is why we're tricked and manipulated. This is why. And I pose these two questions, ladies and gentlemen. If I tell you something that's a lie, I know it's a lie. I know it is. And I tell it to you. And now you believe it, but you repeat it to somebody else. Are you telling a lie or are you telling the truth? I'm not asking what you believe, what you think. I want to know what it is. What is it? Not what your belief of it is. And that's what we do. Well, I believe I'm telling the truth. Okay, that's not what I'm asking you. I'm not asking what you believe about it. I want to know what it is. So when I told you, for instance, because I knew that Honda wasn't more safer than Volvo. I knew it wasn't. But now that you told somebody that Honda is safer than Volvo, are you telling a lie or are you telling the truth? And now people can say, when this is where it gets tricky, right? Because what's the difference between a lie and just getting it wrong, right? What's the difference? See, if I tell you something and I'm just wrong, if I just told you that Honda was safer than Volvo, and that's just what I thought with no information, and I was just wrong about it, well, I didn't lie to you. But then you could say, well, Choosta, I repeated the information you told me and I didn't think about it. So I'm not lying. I'm just wrong because I'm just repeating what was told to me. But I'm going to tell you no, because you repeated a lie. See, if you would have had that original thought and you would have just said, you know, I think Honda is safer than Volvo. It's my opinion of this. You would have then been wrong and not a lie. But then because you told me that Honda was safer than Volvo and that wasn't your thought, that was something that somebody else told you and you just said the same information, that made it a lie. You see, and see, this is why metaphysics are important, ladies and gentlemen. Metaphysics are important. And metaphysics ain't got nothing to do with space and science and biology. See, we don't even know about that. But anyway, I'll digress. Drop a purple heart if you're still here. We rocking out, ladies and gentlemen. And this is what I'm saying. So when we're having a lot of these conversations, if we're not being fair, because now if I just told you that that's a lie, you're telling a lie, and you say, no, it's not a lie, and I'm going to tell you it is, because the people who told you that the Democrats flipped to Republicans and the Republicans flipped to Democrats, see, that was a lie. They knew that that didn't happen. You see, I knew Honda wasn't safer than Volvo, but I just told it to you to make you say the lie, because I wanted you to repeat the lie. See, you didn't think this. You didn't wonder if Volvo was safer than Honda, if Honda was safer than Volvo. You didn't wonder if the Democrats flipped the Republicans. You didn't wonder that. You didn't think it. Somebody told you that and you repeated it. See, this is the difference. And now, if we're looking at all of these different things, a lot of the stuff that we repeat and the information we regurgitate is not the truth. It's just not. So now, for instance, is it true because the UN said it, because 50 other countries said it? Because you know what I could use? I'm going to say, is it the truth that this is the gravest crime against humanity because 50 other or 100 and somebody people, you know, however many people, 150 countries said it, whatever. Is it the truth because everybody said it? Does that make it true? Because we could use the same logic, and this is what I mean by logic. If that's the case, then that means slavery was good then, right? Because so many people at their time said it was a good thing. If we're going to use the metric that 152 countries and so many people said that it is a crime against humanity, and therefore that's what makes it the gravest crime against humanity, can we use the same logic by going back in time and saying 150 something countries and so many nations said that it's a good thing and that we need to do it? Does that make it true by default? If we're just using that metric, if that's, you see how people come to their conclusions, and then you say, okay, because I asked 100 people and 100 people said, so if I ask 100 people and they say something different, does that make it true? Does asking 100 people make something true? Because I remember when a lot of people said 3/5 of a man. And just really quickly, ladies and gentlemen, just going into the Dred Scott and a few different things real quick. Like, we don't even understand, again, another lie really quickly. So when they said that, they didn't say that slaves were 3/4 of a person. That's not what they said. And that gets regurgitated all the time. That, they said we was 3/4 of a man. That's not what they said. What they did say was that slaves count for 3/5 of a vote. Remember, at the time, and I'm not justifying anything, but I just want to put it in historical context so we understand what was said and what wasn't said. So remember, they were enslaving us. They were doing the things that they were doing. So you couldn't vote already. They already were saying you weren't a person, or you didn't have person rights, or you didn't have citizenship and all of that stuff. So that's not even the question. The reason why they came up with 3/5 was to give southern croppers more votes. That's what they came up with that rule for. Because now I could say, hey, I get a vote, but I should be able to get more votes based on how many slaves I own. Not my slaves get a right to vote. And you're not gonna, and so what the compromise was to say that each slave is not worth one vote. That's what the compromise was. So y'all didn't even understand what that was all about. It had nothing to do with your personhood or your citizenship. They were already saying you were not a person. You were not equal to them. They were already saying that you didn't have no rights already. Understand that. So that's not what that was talking about. And it wasn't to make you... Never mind. Oh my God. But here's the crazy part. You know, during that time, you had freed black people already. Black people who were not slaves. And those are the black people who were fighting for rights to say, even though I'm not a slave, I should be able to be a part of an American citizen. Hence the 14th and 15th Amendments. So yes, y'all don't even understand what a lot of this stuff was. Y'all thinking that there was no freed black people during this time and black people didn't have any rights. They did. They just weren't protected federally. There were just states doing, the colonies were just doing their things. Y'all don't even understand what was happening at those times. to just make these assertions. So now I want to know, and look, we regurgitate this stuff. So now, and all of this is a political, geopolitical ideology. Number one, because they know that the Trump administration or first and foremost, the Democrats ain't gonna give you reparations. Joe Biden and Obama Joe had 8 years with Obama to do it and then 4 with Kamala to do it. So twice Joe Biden was teamed up with black people and didn't pass reparations. One time the black person was the head HNIC, the head nigga in charge, didn't give y'all reparations. Kamala never ran on reparations. When she ran, what did she tell you? She said, I'm not gonna do anything specifically for black people. I'm gonna do things specifically for Americans. That's what Kamala even told you herself. So what are we talking about now? What are we even talking about? Democrats had over 16 years to give y'all reparations and didn't do it. What are we talking about? They had how much time to release the Epstein files? Didn't do it. What are we talking about? Why didn't Obama release the Epstein files? Why didn't Joe Biden do it? If anything is anything, if whoever's in it, if Bill Clinton is in it, listen, I'm gonna keep it real. I don't even believe Bill Clinton was doing no crazy man shit with no little kids. As much as I dislike Bill Clinton and his politics, I don't believe this nigga was over there being a pedophiler. I don't believe that. Was he a philanderer? Was he a freak? Is he a gay lord? Do he like to do some freaky weirdo stuff? Probably. I believe that. I don't believe he was doing stuff with underage girls. I don't believe it. Because I don't have no evidence that shows me that. I'm not going to just believe shit blindly. That's why y'all think the Democrats switched to the Republicans and the Republicans switched to Democrats. Y'all just believe shit blindly. But go do, you know what? Fuck y'all, go do some research. Y'all go do some research. Watch this. We're going to do it in real time since we're here. Let's see. Sponsored. Oh, it's not right here. Okay. Who sponsored and legislated more civil rights? Republicans or Democrats? Y'all don't even know. Look, who sponsored and legislated more civil rights, Republicans or Democrats? Republicans have sponsored and supported a higher portion of major civil rights legislation throughout U.S. history when measured by key votes in early foundation efforts, though Democrats played a central role in the mid-20th century passage of landmark bills under Democratic presidents. Reconstruction era, 1860 to the 70s. Republicans did all that. Civil rights, the most comprehensive. So the shit y'all talking about that, oh, the parties flipped and they was the Republicans, but then they became the Democrats. No, stupid. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the most comprehensive anti-discrimination law. This banned discrimination in public accommodations, employment, schools, etc., based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin, signed by Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson. Votes breakdown, higher support from Republicans in both chambers. Yes, it was passed by a Democratic president. We know that, the 64 bill. But listen, in the House, the final passage, Republicans, 80% of Republicans, 61% or 63% of Democrats. Many no votes from Democrats were Southern. So in 1964, when my grandma was alive, In I'm probably about to get an important phone call. In 1964, when my grandmother was alive, when some of y'all parents was alive, it was Republicans, the majority of Republicans that signed the stuff that Martin Luther King was fighting for. What are y'all talking about? What are y'all talking about? Y'all don't know. The 1965 Voting Act. This enforced voting rights and targeted discriminatory practices, also signed by LBJ. Senate Republicans, 94%. Democrats, 73. That's good. House Republicans, 83. Democrats, 78. That's still pretty good. That I'm not gonna rely on the Democrats. That's still pretty good. However, ladies and gentlemen, in 1965, 94 of Republicans voted to say yes, that black people deserve the right to vote unrestricted, without no regards, without interfering. What are we talking about? What are we talking about? This is what I'm trying to explain to y'all. And I'm not saying Democrats didn't do nothing. It was more, they had more than majority. They didn't have more than Republicans. So now if we say, who did more? Who was more pivotal in the 1965 Voting Act? Democrats or Republicans? Oh, well, Choosta, even though more Republicans voted yes in the House and in the Senate, you know, you have to understand that Democrats, and y'all gonna make up some stupid shit that's gonna make me believe that 70% did more than 94%. Get out of here. No, real shit. Get out of here. On me. Get up out of here, man. That's what I'm saying. Y'all don't. 1964 landmark bills, bipartisan passage with higher percentages of Republicans in our lifetime. We ain't got to go back to 1822. We ain't got to go back to Jim Crow. In your grandmother's lifetime, when Martin Luther King was getting million was sicked on him saying, nigga, we shall overcome. And nigga, when Martin Luther King was doing that, it was more Republicans saying they supported Martin, stupid. Y'all don't get that? Y'all don't see that? But y'all don't want to read nothing. Y'all don't want to read anything. In summary, I thought it was going to give us some more bills. Individuals, politicians cross lines. Example, some Republicans opposed the 1964 some Republicans opposed 1964. Most Southern Democrats did. So now, when are y'all telling me that the party supposedly flipped? When did the party supposedly flip? So now y'all telling me that they flipped when? Oh no, Choosta, they flipped when Reagan was in office. That's when they flipped. So now you mean to tell me that they flipped in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s? And they didn't do that, but I'm just going to frame it that way. There was no clean single year switch or flip where the Democrat and Republican parties simply swapped entire ideologies or platforms on civil rights or race or more broadly. Instead, it was a gradual political realignment, primarily of voters, coalitions, and regional power bases that unfolded unevenly over decades, with key accelerations in the 30s, 40s, 60s, and 80s. What actually happened pre-1930s? So let's get to where it matters, because we ain't talking about all that. Southern strategy and voter realignment. Late 1960s through 80s, Republicans like Nixon, 1968, 1972, and later, Reagan appealed to white Southern conservatives and working class voters elsewhere, using themselves using themes of states' rights and law and order, opposition to busing, forced integration, crime, and welfare, often framed as race neutral, but widely seen as coded appeals to resentment over rapid civil rights changes. This wasn't overt segregation. Open racism became toxic nationality, but it helped flip white Southern voters. Black voters consolidated overwhelmingly with Democrats, 80 to 90% by the 70s onward. The South went from solidly Democrat for nearly a century to increasingly Republican at the presidential level by 1970 and 80, and more fully at state-local levels by the 1990s, 2000. Northern liberals solidified in the Democratic Party. Conservatives, including many former Southern Democrats, moved Republican. Key facts that complicate the clean switch narrative. No mass party swap of politicians of the 20. No mass party swap of politicians of 21 Democratic senators who opposed the 1960 rights. Only one, Strom Thurmond, switched to Republican. Most stayed Democrats for decades. Their seats flipped to Republicans gradually over 20 to 30 years via elections, not instant defecations. Voting patterns, civil rights bill. So do you see that right there, ladies and gentlemen? So, and here's the funny thing, right? Because Strom Thurmond, who was a Southern Democrat that Joe Biden praised, who was also part of the KKK, switched to a Republican, and he was one of the only ones. The majority of the Democrats stayed Democrats, and they ended up losing their seats. That's what happened. The parties didn't switch. That's not what happened, ladies and gentlemen. That's not... Oh my God. In short, the parties did realign on civil rights issues and voter basis, especially regionally. South flipping Republican, Black voters, and Northern liberals consolidating Democrat, but it was a messy, multi-decade process of coalition shifts, not a dramatic overnight flip where Democrats became the old Republicans and vice versa. The modern alignment, Democrats as the party of expansive civil rights government intervention on race, Republicans as more skeptical of federal mandates and focuses individual liberty arguments, solidified the 1980s, 90s. This realignment explains much of today's polarized map, but doesn't erase earlier histories. Republican foundational roles in ending slavery or higher percentage reports on 1960, 1965 votes. If you want specifics on particular election platforms or figures, let me know. So they're letting you know, yes, you got a few things over here where Democrats lost seats, parties kind of flipped over there. It was a whole process, 20, 30 years. But guess what? Throughout history, overall, Republicans have always had a clear, consistent history on voter rights and civil rights for Black people. Clear historically. Since back in the day, and when Martin Luther King was doing what he was doing, Republicans have had more percentage on voting on the right side of civil and these systemic rights for Black people and marginalized groups. But listen, ladies and gentlemen, I got all into the weeds on a lot of different things. Again, make sure if you're still here, a purple heart. If you're still here, drop 3 purple hearts, because then I know you really seen the end of it right there, right? Because I'm like, okay, the people who did the 3 purple hearts, I'm like, okay, they actually listened to the whole video. And we're gonna do a lot of stuff coming up, creator support. We appreciate y'all for making my videos, extend in the algorithm. So you liking, sharing, subscribing, sending it to friends, man, I appreciate appreciate it, and I got more than words for y'all. So again, like, subscribe, share the video, all of that good stuff. Remember, local elections are more important than national elections, but dollars are stronger than votes. They won't stop until we stop them. Liberation comes at a cost. Who's willing to pay for it?